Just keeping on that theme of exploring new technologies, this is a Mexican-Canadian artist, Rafael Lozana Hema, whose work is very well known. He has worked in Mexico, Norway, very large-scale installations around the globe. And again, bringing in that element of public realm interactive experience. This is Solar Equation from 2010, and this was actually shown very recently in Federation Square, which is a big outdoor square, and the building you see here is Acme, actually, and I'll introduce that more in just a minute. But this is enormous globe. You'll see the scale of it, fed by, I think, 4 projectors up on the roofs here and held up. And basically, it's looking at the sun, but the whole of the surface is created by an interactive computer program. So again, you can't see it, but it's like the surface of the sun if you see them in the right films, where there's constant flares and motion on the surface of the sun. And he actually introduced the notion whereby you can, from an iPhone, you can interact with it and you can actually stir the surface of the sun. So again, somebody who's been very interested in quite sophisticated technology, but really applying it to a very beautiful outcome, and creating a sense of space and place through doing so. This is now touring internationally. He's a wonderful artist. Moving into areas that you have to start questioning, is this moving image? So UVA, United Visual Artists, work in Britain, and they do a lot of sort of pop-up or festival-based or public realm commissions. This is from 2008, and as you walk through this space, you change the nature of the lights and the sounds in there. So without actually touching anything, you're interacting with the artwork. And again, you know, the question for us, is this moving image or is this really light sculpture? But our view is, where it has that element of motion within it, it's interesting practice. And very commonly you'll find artists who are interested exploring from film into animation, into installation pieces like this. And again, it's one of the reasons we see there being a coherence in the field of the moving image, because the artists themselves are often working across forms. And of course, in the past 5 to 10 years, as technology has allowed these enormous screens with very, very high definition, big outdoor spaces. This is again Federation Square in Melbourne, where you can do performances, community-based events. But these screens are now being used. We have a Tim Burton exhibition I'll talk about in a moment. This is Tim Burton being interviewed on his life, and we did that in our cinema auditorium, but we broadcast it out onto the square where about 2,000 extra people could see this. But these screens are quite interesting. There is an international big screen network now where a lot of this is used for things like news feeds or sporting events. But the better ones are also using these as outlets for artistic practice. And we do this a lot because this is literally opposite our building, so we often do things where we're projecting out on the big screen. And it's quite interesting the way often artists are finding quite short and simple pieces work best here, because people are often drifting through in the public realm, and more using mobile technology, so people are often interacting with the screen through their mobile phone, doing text messages and so on. Okay, I hope I'm going at the right speed for the translation for you. That's a little overview, and some of you will know all the works, some of you it's new to you, but I hope it gives a sense of the variety of work, even just within the more artistic realm of the moving image. I haven't really touched at all upon more mainstream filmmaking or animation because the subject is simply too large, but I hope you'll see the variety of forms and influences and approaches already there, and the way it is almost changing every year the field moves on. It is incredibly rapidly developing. If that's artistic practice, what about institutions, the galleries, the museums, centres for the moving image like my own? We've had to respond to that. This revolution has impacted hugely on us, not just displaying but also collecting these forms, and I've talked a little bit about that in terms of online media. For most of the 20th century, the museum, I suppose, was seen as a place of authoritative record. This is where the history or a history of art could be explored. But in the past 15 years or so, I think this whole conception has been challenged by many cultural, social and other dynamics. And prominent among these has been the digital media and online revolution, and of course most particularly in the past 5 years, the online social media represented most obviously in things like Facebook, Twitter, and such online forms. So you have here now the Take channel, an extremely rapidly growing body of video-based work, some of it interviews, some of it artworks itself, some of it short explorations. And what they're finding there is actually very short grabs are the key way to do this. Most of the work up there is just 2 or 3 minutes long rather than long form. And it's sort of marrying, I guess, the way we're all interacting with the web in ever shorter and shorter sequences. MoMA on Facebook. It's interesting. Glenn Lowry recently, the director of MoMA, recently visited ACME, and he was saying that, like many institutions, his audience is now much larger online than it is people who will come to his physical galleries. I believe I got the figures right. The New York website has grown from around 10 million last year, which is huge in its own right, to 12 million this year. So still incredibly rapidly growing and quite dwarfing the audiences who are coming to the physical galleries. And on his Facebook fan meter, this has doubled in the past year to 250,000 alone. Quite clearly, and I'll explore this in a minute, the nature of the online experience is quite different from the gallery experience, but we have to recognise more and more people internationally are experiencing our galleries through the online world as much as through the physical experiences. And it's not just numbers accessing via the web. I'd just like to explore briefly some aspects of challenges to our core practice that I think are occurring. There is, of course, the contemporary expectation in society of the whole area of social participation and dialogue. And it really is changing the relationship between many museums and their audiences. As well as new critical perspectives on the visual arts, these trends are leading many to conceive of their organisations, and again I use Glenn Lowry, the director of MoMA's words here, as unstable or disruptive institutions. In other words, it's moved from the notion of the art gallery as a repository of an authoritative story or knowledge to one where it is challenging and almost challenging the whole nature of an authoritative story. Certainly that is how Glenn expresses the future of how MoMA see themselves. He also uses terms like they're places for encounters with the unfamiliar rather than places of instruction or definitive statements about a history or rationale of art. And that is quite a radical change. It may seem simple, but it's quite a radical change in the nature of what arts in the most of the 20th century were about. We've also had the notion of art organisations as incubators and almost labs, and there have been many places around the world that have set themselves up as media labs. So the notion of a place where the experimentation that would have happened in a studio has now come out and is happening with the public, and the public are engaging in the creative process itself, which again, it seems to me, quite significantly changes the relationship between the artist and their audience in some ways. I have to say I don't believe all of those have been that successful, but the notion has caught on and changed a lot of practice. There are also places of diversity and contested opinion, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And they're places for exchange and debate, and this is now not just between the museum and the artists and then showing to the public, but it puts the museum, the artist and the audiences on a much more level playing field. And again, I think this presents long-term challenges to the way we actually undertake our practice. So let me just pick up some of the trends and issues that, again, I think aren't particular to the moving image, but the moving image is very strongly related to them and driving. And I don't think any of these are particularly original, but it's worth looking at this whole context, which I think in many ways is far more important than the nature of the technologies themselves. So the first one is globalization, and this is really addressing this greater diversity of voice, culture and audience. The Sydney Biennale director, David Elliott, who has worked in many countries, called this the end of the European Enlightenment, the notion that the Western notion that really the history of art had this incredibly heavy Western tradition from the Enlightenment onwards. I think many are starting to see we have to open that out, and the dialogues across cultures is becoming much more major. And I think, again, Glenn Lowry spoke very well on this. It may seem simple for us just to exchange our cultural forms, but it actually presents really significant challenges, particularly to those in the West, where how you judge art, how you understand the history, where that work is coming from. I think many of us are finding it's a very difficult process to really understand that and how to pick and select the sort of art that should be shown in Western nations. And I think it's why forums like this are so important, that we do understand other cultures. In terms of the moving image itself, then, there is a very rapidly changing creative practice and the technology. And presenting time-based art and also cross-media and creative industry practice in a gallery context or in the public realm really does present phenomenal challenges. You now need a technological skills base that is a very sophisticated one. It's no longer basic videos played out on projectors. You really do have to, if you're going to show, people like Bill Viola have the most extraordinary high expectations of how his art is shown. And really, you're talking about needing significant technological sophistication in your institution, I think, to do this. We are also very keen and support artists for residencies and so on. And what we're finding is having that capability can help artists themselves. Often the artists themselves know what they want to envision, but using the technology is beyond them. So bringing together cross-disciplinary and technological teams to support artists is becoming a much more important thing. And it may seem the technology is getting easier to use all the time, but the creative process is still as complex. Intellectual property, I'll drift over these. This has been changed very strongly, and the whole concept of what is original in the digital realm, I think, is starting to change. How do you decide in an artwork that is net-based, how do you decide what the original is? Who is the author of a piece where the public themselves explored their way around it? And I think these challenges may seem intellectually interesting for the moment, but they will actually lead to changes in practice, is my belief. The nature of the web has created networked audiences. As I've said, many of us will have audiences we'll never see through our doors, and those people expect to engage with us, and I think that will change the way in which we conceive of how we're delivering our programs to our audiences. And for us, very critically in the moving image, there is this huge growth of what's often called the prosumer, the producer, publisher, consumer, and this is both on the professional art practice, where artists are simply bypassing the gallery context to present on the web, but also in terms of the audiences we work with, we find an extraordinary interest in people creating their own works. And this is important because we're enlivening people's interests, and we need to follow through and help them to make those images. And I think also in making the moving image, you actually start to really understand more about the nature of the moving image itself. So we see helping people to become creators is part of them becoming sophisticated audiences for artists and other practitioners. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're doing that. All of this is leading to, really, I would say, challenges to authority and authenticity. The traditional role of curator and the expert specialist, that hierarchy will not go away, but we're now in a much more equal relationship with our audiences. And the big issue there is, if we are going to have to democratize and open out our conversations with our audiences, how do you do that without sort of dumbing down to the lowest common denominator? And I think there's been a lot of work that has actually started to dumb down. And I think how we engage in those ways, while maintaining a sophistication of language, is quite key. And I think part of that is about educating the audiences. So I don't believe the traditional role of artist, storyteller, auteur, or the expert agenda setter is anything but robustly alive. But to ignore this contemporary desire of people to engage, create and critique themselves is something we can't ignore, and we will have to revisit our assumptions